Hello everyone. This is a makeup lecture for a couple of applied ethics courses I'm teaching in fall of 2022. I happened to be sick on a day when we were scheduled to cover two of the classic articles in the ethics literature on abortion. Don Marquis' Why Abortion is Immoral and Judith Thomson's A Defense of Abortion. So let's go ahead and get into these. Don Marquis actually recently passed away over the summer. I'm recording this in October of 2022, and he passed away over the summer. He was one of the few philosophers I regularly teach who I actually knew. He was a professor at the University of Kansas, where I once attended for a year. He taught there for about 5 decades, and he was, just as a note, because people mispronounce his name all the time, it's Marquis. That's how it's pronounced. That is the correct pronunciation. It's not Marquis, it's not Marquis, or anything weird like that. It's just Marquis. That's how you do it. He specialized in biomedical ethics, and particularly around topics like the morality of abortion, the definition of death, the moral status of embryos, and related issues in stem cell research. And he also had a couple of well-known publications about the ethics of clinical trials. So my own personal knowledge of Marquis beyond teaching is this paper, and maybe occasionally another paper of his here and there, is that I took a medical ethics graduate level course way back in the fall of 2009, before I started graduate school in philosophy. So when Marquis, go back in time, 1989, when Marquis was writing this article, he wanted to try to offer a view on abortion that did not rely on the concept of personhood, didn't rely on appeals to potential personhood or fetal potentiality in general, didn't rely on any particular set of religious beliefs. He himself was extremely non-religious, and really was not satisfied with the fact that the pro-life position was almost exclusively defended by Catholics and other people with strong theistic commitments. Oh, let's back up one, skipped one. He also wanted to give an argument on abortion that was connected to a more general account of why killing is wrong. So with those aims in mind, here's kind of what he came up with. He started with, I think, a very uncontroversial point. It's wrong to kill adult human beings, and indeed, if there is any sort of starting point for an argument that seems to be on safe ground in ethics, that's a pretty good candidate for one. So from there, he wanted to think about, why is it that it's wrong to kill adult human beings? Well, one answer you might say is, well, killing can be brutal, it can be painful, it can cause a lot of suffering. But of course, that's not always true. So that can't account for, say, killing someone in their sleep, or killing someone, like giving them a lot of anesthetic and killing them painlessly. An alternative explanation might be that killing harms those who miss the deceased person, or who will miss or have missed the deceased person. But that doesn't explain why it would be wrong to kill hermits or people who have limited connections to others, like maybe no living family members or no close friends or whatever. Right? So even if you killed a hermit and did it painlessly, it still seems like you did something wrong. So there's got to be a deeper explanation than either of these things. So here's what he thought was the right answer. Killing's wrong because it deprives its victim of future valuable experiences. Sometimes this is called the deprivation account of the wrongness of killing. Now I want to point out one just kind of clarification for a couple of my later slides. When Marquis first came up with this approach to abortion, he used the phrase often, a future like ours. He's conceiving of the fetus as having a future like ours, or a flow. Over time, he changed that term to future value because he got some pushback on people basically questioning like what exactly it meant to have a future, quote, like ours. There was some ambiguity in that he wasn't a fan of, and he did not think that that having that particular term was critical to his position. So he later broadened his account to like the future of value view, or saying the fetus has a future of value, much like an adult human being has a future of value. He thought his account of the wrongness of killing had a lot of benefits, a lot of perks. One is, he thought it explained why killing is the worst of all crimes, because he thought you can't lose anything worse than your entire future. right? That's the worst possible thing that you could lose. And that's why when you kill someone, it's considered the worst of all crimes, worse than just causing a person harm or even causing them some kind of serious debilitation. He thought it also explained why cancer or AIDS victims regard their dying as bad, despite, like, it's not imminent, right? But the reason why these folks regard their state of being and the fact that they have a lowered life expectancy as bad is because their future experiences are being cut short, right? So even if their therapy is really effective, and even if they're not in a state of pain or discomfort regularly or anything like that, they're still losing something that's important to them. They're losing future experiences that they could have because their life expectancy is being reduced over what it otherwise would be. Marquis thought that this account has the benefit of avoiding any kind of speciesism. What he means, that term gets thrown around a lot in animal ethics, excuse me, it gets thrown around a lot in animal ethics, but here what it means is it's consistent with the idea that it could be wrong to kill certain kinds of entities that are non-human. It doesn't have to be animals. It could be alien life forms that are sufficiently intelligent or sophisticated, have an understanding of their future, and have future experiences that would be valuable to them. It would explain, it would be consistent with thinking in fiction that non-human species like elves, dwarves, weird anime characters who are like half demon, whatever. It fits with those characters being the kinds of beings that would still be wrong to kill, even though they're not human. Why would it be wrong to kill them? Because they, just like human beings, have future valuable experiences that they'd be deprived of. Marquis also thought it was a benefit that this position does not categorically classify active euthanasia as morally permissible or morally impermissible. It would depend on the future that the person would have. So if you have someone who's suffering really, really severely and doesn't plausibly have, because say they're terminally ill, less than 6 months to live, bedridden, in serious pain, frequently, they may not have very many valuable experiences left. They might think they have none, and they might think that in that sense it would be more beneficial for them to end their life more quickly rather than continuing to live because their suffering is that great. Marquis thought this was a positive feature of his account because he was in some sense open to physician-assisted suicide and active euthanasia, or at least he did not want his account of the wrongness of killing to rule those things out. And finally, his position accounts for why it's wrong to kill children and infants. This is an important advantage in the context of abortion, he thought, because certain kinds of personhood-related approaches, views according to which the fetus is not a person at the moment of conception, run into difficulties when we try to differentiate late-term fetuses from newborn infants, mainly because some late-term fetuses can be born prematurely. So if you have a fetus that's 32 weeks past conception, for example, it could be a premature birth and become an infant. And typically people who hold pro-choice views do not also have pro-infanticide views. But that's hard to explain if you have the personhood account of the wrongness of killing, because it's hard to differentiate what makes it, why is it permissible to kill a late-term fetus that's 32 weeks past conception, but not okay to kill a prematurely born infant that's 32 weeks past conception. There's a consistency challenge there that's really hard to resolve, as it turns out. So Marquis thinks it's an advantage of his account that he doesn't have to deal with that. He's got a very straightforward reason for why it's wrong to kill children and infants, because they have future valuable experiences that they would be deprived of. Okay, so what is the basic argument that Marquis put forward? He starts with, it's prima facie seriously wrong to deprive an adult human being of a future value. This is the reason why it's wrong to kill an adult human being. That's where all this is coming from. A fetus, just like an adult human being, has a future value, and so it's prima facie seriously wrong to deprive a fetus of a future value, because it's got the same good that an adult human being has. And so just as it's generally wrong to deprive an adult human being of a future value, wrong to kill an adult person, thought is the same thing is true of a fetus. abortion clearly deprives a fetus of a future of value, and so therefore, following from these premises and that sub-conclusion, abortion is prima facie seriously wrong. Now, Marquis in this paper does not handle so-called hard cases, but this argument, if successful, does basically put abortion on a par with murdering an adult human being. And so the exceptions on this view, where it's going to be okay to have an abortion, are going to be extremely rare. They're going to be the same kinds of conditions where it would be justifiable to kill another person, like another adult human being. So it's a pretty restrictive position when it comes to the permissibility of abortion. Okay, that is exactly what I just said. So I should have skipped ahead to this slide, but just to reiterate, paper's not about hard cases, but at face value, it looks like abortion's only going to be justified in the same circumstances where killing's generally permissible. And importantly, to back this up, when I took that class from Don Marquis in fall of 2009, he basically reiterated that point. And he essentially said the only time when he believed that abortion, now maybe he changed his views in the last 10, 12 years of his life, I don't know. But as of 2009, when he was teaching this course, because it was a medical ethics course, he taught abortion, he taught his own paper, he taught Thomson, he taught a bunch of other papers. He essentially said on his view, the only time where it's really okay to get an abortion would be if there's a genuine threat to the mother's health, because that would be analogous to a self-defense killing. And just as killing someone in self-defense is permissible occasionally if your life is genuinely threatened, he thought that same rationale could be given to justify killing someone, just to justify killing a fetus if the mother's health was genuinely in jeopardy. Now, I want to point something out that is very seldom known that came out of the literature. Like Marquis's paper was not super popular when it was published in the 1980s. There was a ton of criticism of this argument. Marquis actually did revise his position a little bit in response to a paper published in 2003. This was one of the papers he assigned in that medical ethics class. To my knowledge, this is the only paper, maybe this isn't true, I don't know for sure, but this is the only paper I know of that Marquis genuinely thought the criticism was pretty good, and he revised his position in response to it. He has a ton of responses to critics published between 1989 and like 2010. And for the most part, he held his ground on what he defended in this paper. But this is one case where he made an exception. So in Robert Lane's Why I Was Never a Zygote, Lane argues that the fetus doesn't actually have a flow. Back then, Marquis was still using that term. Doesn't actually have a flow immediately following conception, because there is no singular organism in the initial stages of human development that is numerically identical to the human being that will be born. So what does this mean in practice? What it essentially means is once you have conception, until you get this cluster of undifferentiated cells that later forms, until they combine into one singular organism, Lane didn't think there was any way to identify any particular cell in the uterus that is going to become the fetus that will then become the adult human being that will have the future that's relevant to Marquis's argument. When you just got this cluster of undifferentiated cells, 14, 20, 30 days after conception, that's not enough to ground any kind of numerically identical being that could have the future, the future like ours, or the future of value. The future for those undifferentiated cells is essentially to be assimilated into something else, into the fetus. So he thinks they don't have much of a future at all. Their future is very short-lived. It's somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks, and at some point in there they coalesce into this new being. And so the fate of all those individual cells is to become a new being. They can't have a future. So the practical upshot is that there's supposed to be this narrow period, even on Marquis's view, after conception, but before these undifferentiated cells become a singular organism, where abortion is permissible. So Marquis actually thought this was basically right, as I understand it, again, as he presented this material in fall of 2009, and as he confirmed to me in some discussions outside of class, but he actually thinks this doesn't really matter, because the only period of development that you can be certain there's no individual organism yet is in the first 3 weeks of development after conception. Very, very, very few abortions are performed that early in pregnancy. In most instances, people don't even know they're pregnant that early in the pregnancy. So from a standpoint of whether or not abortion is permissible, Marquis thought this doesn't really affect my position a whole lot in practice, because virtually no abortions are going to be performed that soon after pregnancy. It does, however, have a really significant upshot with respect to contraception, because this means that Marquis actually supports Plan B contraception and certain fast-acting medications that are designed to induce abortion. And the reason is those things are so fast-acting that they will act and have an effect within that 3-week period. And so one of the concerns about Marquis's position historically was that, well, he's going to have trouble, permitting contraception, because there's a worry that, by using contraception, you might be preventing a sperm and egg from uniting and becoming a zygote that would have a future like ours or a future of value. But with this, and Marquis had responses back in the day to those sorts of criticisms, but this is a more straightforward one. Marquis can just say, well, no, that's not true, because I don't think the zygote has a future like ours or a future of value, right? It's not until we have this singular organism that results from, the zygote's further development and clustering with all these undifferentiated cells, until all those cells unite into a singular organism, you don't have a future like ours or a future of value. And so on those grounds, the future of the zygote is just to be assimilated with a bunch of other cells into a singular organism. So in that respect, Marquis has stronger grounds for saying contraception is okay, even Plan B contraception and some similar medications are okay. This is a really, from what I've seen of other people teaching this stuff, this is something a lot of people really don't know about Marquis's considered position, because people often just teach his original 1989 paper, and they aren't aware of all of the criticism that came out of that paper and the ways in which Marquis, responded to, or I guess in this case, conceded some of those criticisms. I want to close this discussion of Marquis by pointing out one other significant objection. And I don't think this was an objection that Marquis conceded or anything, but it's something that comes up often in discussions about his position. Remember that Marquis was trying to bypass the question of personhood. In a paper from 1999, Walter SINNOTT-ARMSTRONG made an argument that kind of put some pressure on that idea from Marquis. So here's what SINNOTT-ARMSTRONG thought Marquis might have established. Maybe Don Marquis succeeded in showing that some fetuses at least have a valuable future. They have some kind of valuable good that they can be deprived of, that they can lose. But Armstrong's question was, is the fetus the kind of entity that has a right to this valuable good? Is it the kind of thing where it's wrong to deprive it of that valuable good? Does it have any legitimate claim to that valuable good? And the problem here is, if we start to entertain that question, then very quickly we wind up dovetailing back into the personhood debate that Marquis was trying to get around, right? He was trying to avoid in the way that he approached the abortion question. Because, of course, the reason why a lot of people think the fetus has a right to its future, a right to its continued existence, a right to its life, is that it's a person at some point, at least after conception. But of course, Marquis was trying to bypass that whole debate. Now again, Marquis spent a lot of time after he published this paper in responding to criticisms. This paper is no exception. He held his ground for the most part on a lot of these criticisms. But this is one that has proven in my discussions with other people who have taught this material, this is a sticking point for a lot of people. A lot of people just think, Marquis didn't really solve the abortion question, because even if you accept his approach, you've still got to address whether or not the fetus is the kind of entity that it's wrong to deprive of this valuable good that it has. And if it's not that kind of entity, perhaps because you think it's not a person, then Marquis's view may not persuade you at all that abortion is wrong. Now, this was 1999, responding Senator Armstrong. By the way, this SINNOTT-ARMSTRONG paper is called You Can't Lose What You Ain't Never Had. That's the actual title. It has a weird subtitle like Response to Marquis or something like that, but I always remember the main title of it. So if you want to look that up, that's where it is. This was a 1999 paper responding to a 1989 paper. Let's go back in time even further, to when Judith Thomson was writing about abortion. Now, Judith Thomson was she passed away around the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, and she taught at MIT for 40 years. She was a big name in a lot of different areas of philosophy, particularly moral philosophy, metaphysics, and the intersection of the two. Had a lot of writings in metaethics. Much of her work in ethics is clearly reflecting a deontological approach to moral problems. And her article on abortion is probably the most famous piece in all of applied ethics. I've not seen the recent data, but at least when I was a graduate student, this was touted as being a defense of abortion was touted as being the most widely anthologized paper in all of philosophy, because any applied ethics course, any medical ethics course, any textbook on those subjects would include a version of her paper, A Defense of Abortion. So, and you may notice from the timelines, like the last time I taught medical ethics was about 5 years ago, and back then both Don Marquis and Judith Thomson were still alive, still writing stuff, and occasionally, still responding to issues related to these classic papers that they published. But those days are unfortunately over. They both lived pretty long lives, but bioethics lost in the last couple of years a couple of very big names. So what about Thomson's 1971 paper? Well, here's kind of some of the backdrop for this. When Thomson originally was crafting this paper, she observed that most debates about abortion hinged on whether the fetus was considered a person. So, and here I'm repeating a definition I've already presented in class a couple of times, but by a person we mean an entity with a moral status comparable to an adult human being. And usually this includes having certain basic rights, including the right to life. Now, what's interesting here, Thomson and Marquis have very different views, as you will discover shortly, but they both wanted to avoid questions about personhood in settling the abortion debate. So Thomson wanted to basically concede. She did not believe this was true, but she wanted to concede, for the sake of argument, that the fetus was a person from the moment of conception, or had the right to life from the moment of conception. And what she wanted to show is, even under that constraint, there are still circumstances where abortion is morally permissible. So here's the way I understand the basic anti-abortion argument. And to some degree, I'm borrowing on what many other people have said about it. This, again, is starting from the outlook that the fetus is a person. Some people would phrase this as a fetus is a person from the moment of conception. Every person has the right to life. So, from 1 and 2, fetuses must have the right to life. If fetuses are persons, every person has the right to life. Fetuses have the right to life. Abortion kills the fetus, so abortion violates a fetus's right to life. The right to life trumps the mother's right to bodily autonomy, and therefore abortion is morally wrong. So this is kind of the broad structure. Historically, the way most people prior to Thomson had objected to this kind of argument was virtually always to question the very first claim, the starting point, the claim that a fetus is a person. Because premise 2, every person has the right to life, that's, I'm not going to say it's a tautology, but it's almost the way person is defined. It follows very straightforwardly from that. Very, very few people have challenged that idea. And number 4, abortion kills the fetus. I don't think that that's technically like always a requirement. Like I can imagine circumstances where you get an abortion and the fetus survives, but in practice, that's typically not how it works. Usually abortion does indeed result in the death of a fetus. So 2 and 4 look pretty difficult to challenge. 1 is what people almost always targeted. What we're going to see is Thomson wants to challenge that claim, the last premise in the argument, the claims about the relationship between the right to life and the mother's right to bodily autonomy. Now, looking at it at face value, you might think that's a really strong premise, because the right to life does seem at face value like it's more important than a person's right to bodily autonomy, right? The right to life is arguably the most fundamental of all rights. If you don't have that right secured, you can't exercise bodily autonomy, or for that matter, any other rights that you might have, right? You want to be assured of your continued existence more than perhaps anything else. So, there are a lot of thought experiments in Judith Thomson's essay. This is by far the most well-known. The violinist case is essentially a thought experiment where you wake up and you are hooked up to this famous violinist in the hospital. Your circulatory system is connected with tubes to his circulatory system. He's got a fatal kidney ailment, and if you disconnect from him, he will die. The way that this happened is you were kidnapped, unbeknownst to you, in the night by the Society of Music Lovers, right? So this violinist is so famous, he's got a ton of fans, and they took you to the hospital. This was the 1970s, so maybe informed consent standards were a little bit more lax than they were back then, because somehow they got you hooked up to this guy without you having to sign a consent form or even apparently be conscious. But put that aside, not important to the case. The key here is you're now awake and you're being confronted with a choice. If you stay connected to the violinist for 9 months, you will resolve his kidney ailment, he can go on with his life, and you can leave. But you have a choice. You can detach yourself from the violinist and he'll die, but you won't have to spend 9 months laying in a hospital bed being hooked up to him. So the question here is, are you obligated to stay attached to him? Thomson thought the answer was clearly no, and in my experience teaching this, the vast majority of people I have asked have also thought the answer is no. In that situation, you are justified in disconnecting from the violinist. The most common reason people give is that you didn't consent to this, right? It's completely involuntary. You've been dragged to the hospital against your will. You aren't required to make such a significant sacrifice under those kinds of circumstances. Now, Thomson's violinist case is an example of an argument by analogy, something that pops up often in applied ethics. The case, or rather group of cases that the violinist case is meant to mirror, basically anytime you have a pregnancy that results from some kind of non-consensual sexual activity. So the thought here is, if you get pregnant because someone else forced themselves on you or otherwise engaged in sexual relations with you when you did not consent to it, then just like the person in this case can disconnect from the violinist, a woman should be allowed to disconnect from the fetus, to not take on the burden of pregnancy under those circumstances. This is meant to be one type of case. It is not the only type of case that Thomson presents in the paper, but it's meant to be one type of case that demonstrates that the right to bodily autonomy can, at least sometimes and under certain conditions, trump the right to life. So if we go back to the argument, you could understand the violinist case as being a counterexample to Claim 6, an attempt to demonstrate here's at least one type of case where Claim number 6, which is actually the fourth premise in this argument, where that fails to hold. And if that's true, then having the fetus, granting that the person is that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception does not entail that abortion is always wrong. Let's bounce back to where we were. And here's what you might be wondering. Maybe you're sold on the violinist case. Maybe you think that's great and all for the specific kind of case of non-consensual sexual activity. Fair enough. I'll grant Thomson that. But what about voluntary sexual acts? What about those kinds of cases? Here's where things get a little weirder. And yes, the violinist case for the context of this paper is not that weird. Thomson gives an example, which I'm just calling here the people seeds example. She wants us to imagine we live in a world where there are people seeds floating through the air. If one of these seeds happens to get inside your home, the seed will take root in your carpet and a person will sprout. Now, you want to be able to at least occasionally open your windows or leave your doors cracked or things like that. Let some fresh air into your house. So you put up screens on your windows and possibly your doors to prevent people seeds from getting inside your home. But due to a defect in one of the screens, a seed gets in there anyway. And now the question is, would it be okay for you to remove that seed from your home? And here again, Thomson thinks the answer is, well, actually she answered the violinist case. It's like, just like you can disconnect from the violinist, that's an affirmative answer. Here, she says it would be permissible for you to remove the now growing person. So it's okay for you to disconnect from the violinist, also okay for you to remove the people seed in this kind of case. The idea here is that this is supposed to be a situation where you're engaging in voluntary sexual interaction, but you're using some form of contraception, right? That's what the screen is supposed to be. And the idea is, in that situation where you are taking deliberate action and have a clear intent of not getting pregnant, then even though you are engaging in voluntary sexual interactions, just like the person in the people seeds case is voluntarily choosing to have open windows instead of keeping them shut all the time, the thought is, in this kind of case, you can indeed permissibly get an abortion under this set of circumstances. So Thomson specifically says you don't have responsibilities to provide what a person needs for their survival unless in some way you have assumed those responsibilities. So she says if you had a situation where a couple decides not to get an abortion and then they take the child home after they've gone to the hospital and the mother's gone through labor, at that point you're assuming responsibility for that child in some capacity. And so that's where you really are responsible for providing what that child needs for their survival. But if you haven't assumed that responsibility, she thinks you're still justified in, you can still be justified in having an abortion even if it ends the fetus's life. Now, this is an objection she mentions in the paper that comes up fairly often. This is a relevant dissimilarity between a lot of her cases and actual cases involving reproduction. We usually think that parents have special obligations to their children, but a lot of Thomson's cases, including the violinist case, including the people seeds example, and including a couple of the other more obscure cases that I've not mentioned here. This is why this lecture is not a substitute for actually reading these articles, or one reason among several. Thomson's cases look like they're mostly about our duties to strangers. So some people have an intuitive reaction to the violinist case of thinking, well, yeah, of course it's okay to disconnect from the violinist. You don't know that person. You have no relationship to them. But if that person wasn't the violinist and they were like, I don't know, my brother or a really, really close friend of mine, might be different. My intuition might be different. I might think that I do have, by virtue of my relationship to the person, I do have some kind of obligation to stay connected and not let them die, even if I was kind of hooked up against my will. And that's kind of a problem, because Thomson's cases being about duties to strangers risk breaking the analogy between her examples and actual cases of abortion. So again, Thomson thinks, she argued that the biological relationship alone doesn't establish special responsibilities. I'm not sure that this response is all that convincing, the way she puts it in the article at least, because it's not just the raw biological relationship. It's also the causal connection. Um, so, you know, in these kinds of cases, there is some kind of way in which you are causally tied to the creation of this new person. That's not obviously true. Like, you didn't cause the people seeds to be, you know, present in the atmosphere. You didn't cause the violinist to have his fatal kidney ailment. You're just kind of a bystander who's been pulled into those situations. But in the case of actual pregnancy, at least sometimes, at least with voluntary acts, it looks like there's a clear causal connection between your presence, your choices, your actions, and the existence of the the as yet unborn child. So I'm not sure if this response taken, just again, based on what she says, maybe there are ways to fix this problem. Maybe there are ways to have a more compelling response than what she says in the paper. But not everybody is convinced that Thomson adequately dealt with this problem. And appropriately, I will note that Marquis, when he taught Thomson's essay in his class, so one of the things I want to point out that you may have noticed, Marquis wrote his paper 18 years after Thomson, but he doesn't actually say a whole lot about Thomson's paper in his own. And you might think that's weird. And the short answer to it is, as I learned when he taught this medical ethics course back in 2009, Marquis didn't think Thomson's paper was very good. He thought that this was a fatal flaw in her analogies. He thought that they were cool stories that really didn't show a whole lot because they didn't adequately deal with this objection. So he just didn't think this was as good a paper as a lot of people do. A lot of people credit this paper by Thomson as radically altering the way we talk about abortion and the way that the literature has evolved on it in applied ethics. But Marquis was not one of those people. Marquis did not think that he thought that the paper was interesting, but did not think that it held up to philosophical scrutiny because there were too many relevant dissimilarities between the cases that Thomson uses and the actual cases of abortion. He was not convinced by her overall style of argument. So that takes us to the end of this little overview. This is, to reiterate, just the highlights from these articles. This does not deal with everything that was said in them. It does not cover all of Thomson's cases. It does not cover every single one of Marquis's elaborations on his particular position. So remember to actually read that material if you want the full treatment. But for the highlights, I think this is gives a good overview. And if you want to dig into this stuff a little bit more, I encourage you to read these articles and also to read some of the criticisms that have come out, because these articles, they're old. Marquis's is over 3 decades old. Thomson's is over 50 years old. But we're still talking about these pieces in academic philosophy. There is still debate about which of these authors, if either of them, got the abortion issue right. So even though these are old pieces, they have not lost their relevance.